to see, one would say, alive. In modern terms, it's maximum what we can do, because he is restricted to Oxford. I would say he is chained to Oxford. Professor Jonathan Stern, who is not only the best global specialist on all natural gases, but also he was the pioneer of the studies in this field before people actually realized that time of gas came after all this dirty coal and oil. Now we have him online for his lecture, which I just summarized for him as Europe was the birthplace of mass use of natural gases, and probably it may become the cemetery of the natural gases. I understand he has 45 slides, which will be probably available for consuming and digesting after all. Jonathan, please.
Hello, everybody in Moscow. So very nice to be with you, if only virtually. This is what I'm going to talk about, the role of gases in the energy transition and whether Europe is a special case. For those of you who don't know our institute, we are very small, still to be working on fossil fuels in an academic context. But of course, increasingly, we are working on decarbonisation, as that is the current agenda. So this presentation is essentially based but updated from an article that I published in Vопроsi Ekonomiki, I guess last year. Leonid can tell us exactly when it was published, which has the same title. And I'm going to start by talking about Cop21 in general, very briefly, and the European commitments. So I think for most people in the world, 2020 was the year of the pandemic, but for energy people, certainly in Europe, it was the year of net zero. The key question really is, we have a number of very large countries, the EU as a group, China, Japan, Korea, and most recently the Biden administration in the US, who've signed up to 2050 carbon neutrality, 2060 in China. And we have a number of other very important energy markets globally, Russia, Brazil, India, which have COP21 commitments, but it's not clear that they will increase those commitments to net zero, and it's not clear exactly what actions they're taking to achieve their commitments. A very big difference with Europe is that we have something of a roadmap for how this will be achieved, and it is backed by very substantial financing commitments, although only up to around 2027. So I guess then the question is, why is Europe different? And my explanation is that Europe is different because there is political and specifically pressure from voters to achieve decarbonisation targets. In Europe, but I should perhaps stress, particularly in the old member states, which one might call somewhat incorrectly rich Europe, Northwest Europe, Spain and Italy, many of the big energy and economies in Europe, including the UK, although no longer an EU member state. Energy policy is obsessed with decarbonisation, and there is huge public pressure on governments. Much talk of a climate emergency, big demonstrations by Extinction Rebellion, lots of talk about Greta Thunberg. my impression when I was able to travel to other parts of the world is that in other regions, there are more important issues such as energy affordability, air quality, energy security, which are probably more important than decarbonisation. But Europe is, I think, very important in the sense that climate policy and the success of climate policy may increasingly be a factor in elections and whether particularly young people are going to vote for a particular party. So with that as the kind of introduction in general, what about the timeframes? And I think the first thing to say is that net zero is a considerable step up from COP21. And in particular in Europe, 2030 is an absolutely key date because of the sub-target that by 2030, Europe must have achieved at least a 55% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions compared with 1990. Now, for that to happen, the pathways have got to be chosen and funded, and the technologies have got to have advanced significantly. Because if you haven't reached a certain threshold by 2030, then there's really no chance that you'll reach net zero by 2050. Now, I'm going to talk in a few minutes about some modeling, but the problem with modeling is that you can actually cheat using models by assuming much faster progress in your spreadsheet post 2030. The correction for this, which is what we do in our group, is that we look at the lead times for developing technologies and then rolling out those technologies. And we don't allow our modelers to put unrealistic numbers into the spreadsheet just in order to achieve the 2050 targets. Now, COP21 was ambitious, but it allows much more time for full decarbonisation, probably around 2030 for the world as a whole, and also more time to develop advanced technologies. In addition, it costs less to achieve those targets because the more urgency you have for achieving the targets, the more money you need to spend upfront in order to accelerate both technologies and rollout. And that probably translates into higher carbon taxes. But I'll come back to these issues later in the presentation. So when we look at the modeling that's been done for Europe, what we see is that, and this is the left hand of these charts, Europe is not on track to meet 2030 targets. You can see with those dots that we're currently on track possibly to meet a 40% reduction, but some way away from meeting a 55% reduction. And you can also see what needs to happen in terms of investments under existing policies. We need to be spending a significant amount more money, especially in areas like transport and the residential sector, if we're going to have a chance of getting to the targets that we're looking for. And these are, if you like, this is official data. So this is not, as it were, academic data. This is data which has been issued by the agencies themselves. So a key question is, if as we get 2 or 3 years on, it's evident that Europe is not going to meet these targets, what is the policy response going to be from governments and also from voters? And we are really fascinated by this because almost all of the official government commentary on the targets is that we must meet them, but we're not on track to meet them. So What kind of options do we have? Well, most of the major studies from almost every source see full electrification as a more expensive pathway than the mix of electricity and gases. But the problem with electrification is that many of the environmentally based studies only consider renewables. They don't consider nuclear power. And of course, nuclear power is a big problem, and in fact, pretty much eliminated in many major European countries. Everybody wants efficiency and demand management, and everyone has the idea that coal phase out is a quick option, although in some countries, particularly in Central Eastern Europe, this is going to cause major employment and therefore political problems. Net zero policies require technology choices, and I've put here governments must pick winners. This is a reference to a lot of economic literature and energy economics literature from the 1990s, when we were back in the privatization and liberalization era, which said governments must not pick winners. Governments must allow the market to decide which technologies are the most efficient, and then allow investors to take their own financial decisions. Now, the problem is that allowing the market to decide is going to take far too long in relation to the targets which Europe has entered into. So, at least my view is, governments have actually picked winners already. They've decided that hydrogen, particularly from electrolysis, so-called green hydrogen, but also possibly from natural gas, and in one or two countries, maybe even coal, will be winners. Pyrolysis, we don't know about yet because the technology has not reached an advanced enough stage. Batteries, we've decided, is a winner. Carbon capture and storage may be a winner in some countries where it is possible, but I'll come back to that later. And of course, carbon taxes and prices are going to have to be raised very substantially. So what do we need to do? Well, in relation to gas, what you see here is 4 public domain scenarios. 2020 Sustainable Development Scenario, the Shell Sky scenario, which is a scenario that goes all the way to 2100, and that is a Cop21 scenario. Again, Equinor rebalance, which is kind of Cop21 plus, and then the BP net zero scenario, which is the only net zero scenario of these 4. So you'll see that there's quite a degree of divergence, except that they all peak, global gas demand peaks in all of these scenarios around 2030. And then it's a question of how fast it declines. But the global scene doesn't really tell you what you want to know. You really want to know what's going to happen in the different regions, and if possible, what's going to happen in the different countries. So if you look at the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario, for everywhere, I've taken Europe out, as I showed you that before. Look at what it says for these regions. Indian demand over 200 BCM and rising in 2040. Middle East demand steady, 500 BCM. China, 500, rising throughout the period. North American demand collapses post-2030. Russia is relatively steady, a little bit lower in 2040. And then if you take those numbers and look at what the Sky scenario says. So in the Sky scenario, India barely rises above 100 BCM, not that much more than today. Chinese demand collapses after 2040 to basically what we have in terms of demand today. Middle East remains robust, pretty much, a little bit of decline in 2050. Latin America, much, much higher than in the other scenarios. Then if you look at Equinor, you have China, which really doesn't get above 400 BCM. India, similar to the previous one, 100, hardly rising, considering what a big country India is. North American demand collapses after 2040. And the final one I want to show you is the BP. This is the only net zero scenario, remember. Indian demand, very bullish, 250 and rising in 2050. China, steady, over 500 BCM. Russia, collapsing, below 200 BCM by the time we get to 2050. North America, also much, much lower than in the other scenarios. So really, what does this tell us? What it tells us is that you can achieve COP21 and net zero global emission targets with not only very different outcomes for global gas demand, but very different regional gas impacts. But all of the models suggest a good future for gas for the next 10 years, and in many regions up to 2040. The big divergences and the big arguments among gas analysts are for the big markets. In other words, what happens in China, North America, Middle East, Russia. This is what is going to significantly impact the global picture. But all models see Asia, especially China, but Asia in general as the major growth region for gas, at least for the next 20 years. What about the impact on global gas and LNG trade? So here's a chart from the Shell LNG Outlook. I'm going to start with LNG for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. This is from the Shell LNG Outlook, which came out a few weeks ago. And this is just a business as usual projection. And this shows us what we already know, that we're expecting a big increase in LNG demand, and about 75% of that will go to Asia. Europe will pick up what anybody else doesn't want, and there's not very much in the rest of the world. So the major incremental importers, China, India, and Southeast Asia. And this is why it's so terribly important how we project demand in those countries. Again, a little bit more granularity for Asia import projections to 2050. China, pretty much the single largest contributor. We have less demand for LNG in Asia. Some projections have more, but Southeast Asia becomes really a very, very important area. And although these countries are relatively small compared with China, for example, over the next 20 or so years, they become extremely important. And if we look here, we're looking at potential growth, business as usual scenario, 200 BCM by 2050. Pakistan, particularly Singapore and Thailand, because their pipeline contracts are ending, and Malaysia and Indonesia with rising demand and static production. So those are business as usual scenarios. This is a scenario that we in Oxford have done for a decarbonisation. This is COP21, not net zero. This is a COP21 scenario. Now, COP21 scenario, you see LNG imports peaking in the middle of the 2030s. Basically, India and Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, until that time, they increase because gas is displacing coal. But by 2050, you've got 40% less LNG than you had in the business as usual case. And China falls very sharply after 2040. And the reason this is very interesting and important is because most of the LNG projects that are being entered into today are targeting China. They're targeting Asia. So if this is the correct way to look at the future, then if you're today developing an LNG project because you think you're going to sell that LNG in China, well, you may not have more than about 10 years of really strong sales. So I want to just spend one slide on gas pipeline imports. And this is something that we're developing in our modeling. And this is about one of the only things that's easy. So much easier than almost anything else. Why? Because there are very, very large interregional pipeline gas projects in the world. Most of them involve Russian gas. And we can, as a group, vote on whether we think those projects are going to happen or not going to happen. And we can be very specific about them. There are about 5 or 6 projects in the world where you have pipeline gas projects of more than 25 BCM. And as I say, at least 2 or 3 of them are Russian projects. The others involve South Asia and Iran and Turkmenistan. So pipelines are not going to disturb the world very much, even in the low scenario. LNG is the big driver for trade. What does that mean? Well, if we go back to Europe for a moment, what it means is the impact of European targets on natural gas exporters, if Europe is really going to reduce natural gas demand and imports, is that pipeline exporters such as Russia have to consider supplying gas with nature-based offsets like forest offsets, or, which is the current really popular trend, supplying hydrogen either via reformed natural gas with carbon capture and storage or pyrolysis. And of course, pipelines are where they are, whereas LNG suppliers have options to sell in other markets. But if Europe starts to dramatically reduce LNG imports, then there's going to be a surplus of LNG globally, and that's going to result in much lower prices, unless that LNG is used again to develop blue hydrogen with CCS. The key thing to think about for other countries is whether if they aspire to achieve net zero by 2050 or 2060, whether this means a similar reduction of gas and LNG as I showed you for Europe. And I think the answer is probably not, or at least not as dramatic. So let me now go through, I think, some really critical policy regulatory assumptions which will determine the outcomes for natural gas, but also other gases. And this is what I'm going to talk about. Each of these is a very big and complicated subject, and I'm just going to try and hit a couple of highlights, maybe a slide or 2 on each of them, just to give you a sense of what the big issues are in connection with each of them. And I'm going to start with the EU Methane Strategy that was published in October 2020. I'm not going to read out all the words on this slide. The key elements for me I've marked in red. The so-called benchmark standard. This is about actual measurements of methane. Up till now, most of the reporting of methane emissions has been so-called standard emission factors, usually taken from US Environmental Protection Agency literature. What the EU is saying now is we don't want standard emission factors anymore. We want you to measure the methane that is being emitted from your natural gas and your oil and your coal and your agriculture operations. And what we want you to do is to achieve that through a mix of ground level data and satellite data. They are pointing to the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership as the best existing framework to determine how to measure and how to report those emissions. They propose the creation of a global methane observatory hosted by the UN, possibly with International Energy Agency cooperation, in order to collate and publish the data. They have legislation which will require obligations to report and repair, to eliminate routine flaring and venting, and they are particularly focusing on gas and to a lesser extent oil, with coal mines which are much more complicated to be addressed later. They've proposed an international coalition of importing countries, particularly the big Asian LNG importers, to coordinate rules for energy sector emissions. This isn't going to happen immediately. We're still waiting for the draft legislation, which would be, they say October, but everything has been delayed by the pandemic. I think it'll take a year to agree. It'll take another year, perhaps more than a year, to be transposed into national legislation. But I don't rule out that some of the big European countries will move ahead with this before the EU legislation is established. I think very important for the Russian audience is this inclusion in the strategy of what I call persuasion versus compulsion. Essentially, the EU is saying, we're going to have an outreach campaign and we will offer you technical assistance if you need it to measure these emissions. But if you fail to do that, if you fail to follow our rules, we will then impose on you a default value for your emissions. And if we don't get commitments from you, we will propose legislation on targets, standards, and other incentives. And this is very, very controversial. We're not certain whether this is going to be, whether this will work with WTO discrimination issues, imposition of extraterritorial regulation is always very complicated. However, it is a kind of, we want to persuade you to do this, you guys who supply us with gas, but if we fail to persuade you, if you don't do this, we're threatening you that we're going to impose values on you. And then, of course, those values will be used for any taxation which is imposed on emissions in the future. This is also going to apply in the LNG space, and in Asia, we've already had so-called carbon neutral LNG cargoes. I've written down the ones that I know about. These are problematic because essentially what they're saying is we have used offsets for, we've purchased offsets for these cargoes, and so when you import them, you can regard them as carbon or actually greenhouse gas neutral. But there is no transparency about any of the measurements, the methodologies, the volume or the value of the offsets, whether the data were independently verified. We know nothing about this. We just have the reports from the companies. More interesting, and I think more persuasive, is as the Singapore company Pavilion, which has now agreed 2 contracts for cargoes with a defined greenhouse gas content. So these are not carbon neutral. They are contracts which say, for every cargo, you will tell us what the greenhouse gas content of that cargo is. You'll tell us how you measured it, how you're reporting it, and whether it was independently verified. Again, we don't know details of this, but this seems to me to be something which, if it's successful, could become an industry standard. So this leads on to, I mentioned earlier, a much more specific accounting for greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we all have heard the story of how coal to gas switching reduces greenhouse gas emissions because gas emits 45% less CO2 than coal and 25% less than oil. The problem is that when you add methane emissions to both gas and coal, you probably still, and I'm quoting in the middle of the slide, I'm quoting the IEA statistics, you still get a significant reduction. The problem is that averages are no longer going to be acceptable. What we're going to have to know is what was the greenhouse gas footprint of the coal that you were using? What is the greenhouse gas footprint of the gas that you are going to replace it with? Because this is now being challenged by all environmental organizations saying that with methane emissions, gas is no better than coal and in fact could be worse than coal. So if coal to gas switching in Asia is going to be taken seriously as part of a reduction strategy, we have to have really serious and verified data. Moving on through other major issues that are going to impact gas, I just got one slide on biomethane. Now, there is a lot of biomethane literature which shows bigger potential than this slide shows. I'm using it only because this slide shows something really quite interesting, which is that the biggest potential for biomethane is in Asia Pacific and not in Europe and the United States. And I think that's really very important because even if these numbers are conservative, it really does not seem to make much difference to the issues for Europe of producing biomethane. Incidentally, you can find biomethane estimates in Europe of 100 BCM just for Europe by 2040. I leave it up to you to think whether you think these are credible. Also very important is how natural gas prices gives you a great deal of economic viability. Obviously, you need much higher natural gas prices in order to get greater viability for biomethane. I'll come to that. I'll come back to that in a moment. But these could make some difference in a country like India, for example. But I mentioned earlier that it's hydrogen which is really the subject of the moment. So here's a slide from the BP Energy Outlook. And I think what's interesting here is that on the right-hand side, the major hydrogen markets are thought to be China, North America, Europe, and a little bit of other Asia. But on the left-hand side, you'll see that for net zero, blue hydrogen, hydrogen from fossil fuels with CCS is still nearly 50% of the total. And that is an indication of the importance of CCS if hydrogen is going to become a major source of energy. For hydrogen, of course, we have really serious cost issues. This is again a chart or complicated chart of showing how the costs of hydrogen might come down over a long period. The slightly tricky thing here is that most of us are not familiar with trying to translate hydrogen costs into gas prices. And in general, it's thought that €1 per kilogram of hydrogen is about 25 euros per megawatt hour as a gas price, or $8 a million BTU. So you can see that at the moment in 2020, green hydrogen, hydrogen with electrolysis, is significantly out of the question, and even blue hydrogen is very, very expensive. Just to put that in context with biomethane, it's a lower range, but both of those ranges are still really problematic if you look at natural gas, where today we're closer to the bottom of that range than the top of it. And so the big question, the big bet is what's going to happen with the costs of hydrogen? And the other big question is, people talk a lot about the cost of electrolyzers, but what this chart shows is that for green hydrogen, it's the cost of electricity which is the big issue. Electrolyzers are important, but they're by no means a determining factor of the costs of electrolysis. Here you see, you can see that the net zero requires about 3/4 of natural gas to be used with carbon capture, which means about 5.5 billion gigatons of CO2. That's a conservative number. I've seen numbers up to 7 or 8 gigatons of CO2 needing to be captured. But if you look at where we are today, we have 40 million tons of operational CCUS facilities, and all the capacity under construction development is only 120 million tons. And we've got to get to 5 to 7 billion tons. So you can see if blue hydrogen is going to be a really serious contender for future energy balances, we've got to have an awful lot more carbon capture, or pyrolysis has got to be a very successful technology. So let me just mention the issue of price. This is from the International Gas Union Wholesale Price Survey. And what you can see here is that there are two groups in the world, Europe and Asia, which have paid $6 to $11 a million BTU for gas roughly over the last 15, 20 years, whereas all other parts of the world paid less than $4. Obviously, you need to go into countries, which I don't have time to at the moment, but this is a problem when you look at the longer term spot prices. This is our model. Other models are somewhat similar, where you've got waves of price of around $6 to $8, $6 to $9 in Japan and China. Should be okay. But Henry Hub has got to be at less than $3 if the US LNG exports are going to be profitable. And as we get to the 2030s, when you see those Asia lines going up, that's going to be too high for many of the South Asian countries, India, and also the Southeast Asian countries that I showed you earlier, and also too high if we're going to have large-scale blue hydrogen as CCS development. But maybe the most important element here is carbon taxes. And what you see here is that carbon prices or carbon taxes, the top two lines are developed countries and the bottom two lines are developing countries. But in 2025, they've got to be in developed countries $40 to $63 a ton. We've just about got to 40 now in the EU, and roughly double that in 2030, and roughly doubling again in 2040. And if we don't get those carbon tax increases, then most of the technologies that I've spoken to you about just aren't viable, or they've simply got to be developed by government, which is, in a sense, state ownership for much of the energy sector. So let me now draw this to a conclusion. The governments have to decide what they're going to try to do. If they can switch from coal, as long as they can justify that this will indeed be a big saving in emissions, they will. Many in Europe have already switched. If they can develop nuclear, that will take a long time. Many in Europe certainly can't do that. We've talked quite a lot about the switch to hydrogen and the problems of costs and of technology. Carbon prices and taxes need to go up dramatically, and they need to set both sectoral targets. In other words, basically mandating regulations such as it will not be possible after a certain date to sell boilers that do not use that use gas, that must use hydrogen. But there is such a tremendous amount to do. And that's why I think global gas and LNG demand looks robust up to 2030. After 2030, the story is different in each country. But it will be very important that both gas and LNG companies demonstrate real efforts to decarbonize and back that by data which can be independently verified. I would think that gas and LNG use will be concentrated in the so-called hard to abate sectors. That means high temperature industry, probably residential, maybe heavy trucks and marine, but not power generation. So the final slide really goes back to whether we should consider Europe a special case. And certainly the major European gas markets, the big markets in Northwest Europe, Spain and Italy, with aggressive commitments, I think are really very much a special case. If they succeed in meeting their targets, the role of gases that they decide on could be a role model for other regions. But in Europe, the decline post 2030 is going to be steep. That's demand and imports. And after 2030, we're going to see other regions have to make efforts again if they're going to meet their targets. North America is probably the most similar to Europe, especially Canada and some of the bigger US states on the coasts. I think in Asia, we're looking for gas demand and imports to grow significantly and peak later, probably in the 2040s. Middle East is similar, but of course, no real imports there, just demand. You guys in Russia and other CIS countries, probably not much demand increase, but a slower decline. And Latin America, probably not much change there. So with, again, apologies for my dreadful internet connection, the answer is yes, Europe is a special case, but for the next 10 years, it's still going to be a pretty good market in which to sell gas. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you very much. Since you were fighting your environment, internet environment, so you didn't have any rest in the pauses. I suggest everybody maybe use this like opportunity to put some questions. Okay. I have one. What I draw from your presentation, like it was from your article, and you understand that you will be widely quoted because I check the reading of our articles in this issue. You are one of the champions of being read by people. What I understand, we have multiple crossroads in terms of technology and costs. Mm-hmm. And since regulation may be imposed fast in a few years, but technologies and costs are not changing that fast. So, and your if for the Europe means it's not quite clear. Can it be? My question is, I understand if it was planned for 2040, but for 2030 it looks like gambling a little bit, political gambling for me. Because of not because of lack of decisiveness in the European countries, because national elections push them in these directions. We understand the mechanism, but how can you make it in a few years because 20 is already started? Could you comment on the feasibility to meet targets?
I think you have to go down to the country level. So, for example, if you are a country like the UK, where you have quite a lot of relatively low-cost renewables, especially wind, you have a relatively inefficient capital stock still, then you have a chance. But the key problem for all European countries is that governments have not yet explained to the voters that this is going to require pain in terms of higher bills or higher taxes, and also behavioral change. So, you know, we need to introduce regulations such as after 2025 or 2030, you will no longer be able to buy a car which uses liquid fuels. You will no longer be able to install a gas boiler in your house in place of the gas boiler that you have. That means you may have to completely reconfigure the heating in your house. All of these things are not yet clear for the population. And for me, the big test electorally comes when those issues are made clear. That if we are serious, then we have to spend a lot of money. And the quicker we want to achieve the targets, the more money we have to spend. And I think that's the, I find it difficult to judge.
I knew that I should be quick if I want to answer. So I used my privileges, I would say monopoly for moderation today. I'm very sorry, but I knew what I was doing. I didn't take any risk. I asked the question first. But I think he will be back to answer the rest of questions the same way as it happened in the last hour. I was thinking, discussing this problem with that electorate should be maybe a problem to digest the news.
Yep.
And the crucial will be election after the truth will be said. My problem is that probably electorate will never be given the truth before elections.
Well, I mean, I think there's probably not before elections, but after elections, and 2030 is 9 years away, a little bit 9 years away. Now we need to introduce these changes in order to give time to have the effects that we need to meet targets. It's not much time, and I don't know. We're in a very complicated position in Oxford, because when we say things like this, it's easy for people to dismiss us as, oh, well, you guys are just supporting fossil fuels. You're denying the seriousness of this. The world is full of campaigners and not so full of analysts.
Right. And I would say that some young people believe that 9 years is a big of time. It's a lot of time.
If you're young, it is.
It's completely wrong. It's just like that. But you have a question from economician Ivanova on technology. Look at in the chat.
Okay. Oh.
Because I monopolized the first question because I'm old fossil fuel man.
Okay, so the question is, do you know any cost-effective technology or reliable hydrogen production transportation projects in Europe? And the answer is, these projects are currently being developed. They are they are still at the early stage, and we have the first, I would call, large-scale carbon capture and storage project in Norway. We have some hydrogen projects of gigawatt scale electrolyzers, and we are seeing at least advanced proposals for blue hydrogen projects in Northwest Europe. But cost effective is not, it depends what you mean by cost effective. If you mean projects which do not require subsidy, no. All these projects require huge subsidy. One example, the Northern Lights project in Norway, which is Norwegian government and Equinor and Total and Shell, is going to recover, I think I'm right in saying, 3 or 4 million tons of CO2. It's not a hydrogen project. It's recovering 3 or 4 million tons of CO2 from industrial projects in Norway and storing that. It recently received the final investment decision, but we estimate that the Norwegian government is providing 2/3 of the capital investment. Now that gives you an idea of just how much support these projects are going to need. And I showed you our cost chart for hydrogen, particularly green hydrogen, but even blue hydrogen. You know, we're talking 3 to 10 times the price of natural gas today in Europe. And now, if you say this to people in the environmental sector, they will say, and they're right, yes, but we said the same thing about wind and solar power 10 years ago, and now look, they're competitive. Yes, I think that's right. The problem is we haven't got 10 years to wait. We have to do this now in order to get these projects off the ground. There's another question here.
Yes.
How would you define the role of environmental impact assessment for large-scale energy projects in the face of decarbonisation targets? I think you have to be very specific about what kind of energy project you're talking about. So, for example, you might do an excellent environmental impact assessment for, shall we say, a nuclear power project. But in many countries, they're simply out of the question because they have no support from society and they have no financial support from government. If you're looking at, for example, a wind farm, and particularly an offshore wind farm, it's extremely important to do this assessment. But already you have a favorable environment because this is seen to contribute to decarbonisation, and you have support from society. The difficulty, the support question is when you move on land. So for example, if you're trying to launch a big solar power project, which will take up a lot of land, then you might be in a little bit of a conflict situation. So you'll find that some parties are saying, it will compete with agriculture, it will reduce the amount of produce we can. Other people are saying, no, it's a very good thing because it contributes to decarbonisation targets. So they're very important, but complicated in relation to the exact project.
Yeah. Natasha, Natalman.
Mine, I have one more question, but it's too long to write it. Professor Stern, it's a question about the quality of regulations. We know the European program 2020, Europe 2020, about 20% decreasing of energy consumption, 20% of renewables, and something like that. So I have no clear question. Does this program is fully implemented or not? And what are the lessons of regulations of such big problems in energy like this one?
So I think that that part of the 2020 has been implemented. And I think I'm right in saying the part that has not is efficiency. So the renewables part was implemented, but efficiency, I think in many countries we have struggled to implement. What are the lessons? Well, as a slightly cynical person, I would say the lessons are: do not adopt slogans. You know, everything had to be 20. Why did it have to be 20? Well, because it was a good slogan to say 20, 20, 20. The lessons of regulation for me are many people will say you must adopt extremely ambitious targets, because even if you miss them, if you don't adopt ambitious targets, then you won't achieve your full potential. Better to adopt an ambitious target and fail to meet it than a conservative target, which everyone thinks, oh, well, we don't have to work very hard because we can easily meet this target. But the real lesson of regulation, which we are very much debating amongst ourselves in Oxford, is this. The regulation that we have for gas and electricity was designed for liberalization. It was designed for competition. It was not designed for decarbonisation. And now there is a big debate as we try to introduce decarbonised technologies. Okay, we're going to introduce electrolyzers. Should we say that the companies which supply electricity or the companies which distribute electricity through networks should not be allowed to own electrolyzers? Because we have to separate supply from networks. That is our unbundling regulation. And the answer that many of us give is that unbundling was good when we were introducing competition. But decarbonisation is something fundamentally different. And therefore, what we are trying to do with decarbonisation is to introduce new and challenging technologies very, very quickly. We should say to everybody, please develop everything you can as quickly as you can. But say to them, now, if in 10 or 20 years' time you have become a monopolist and we see you as an impediment to competition, then we may force you to sell some of these, whatever they are, electrolyzers or carbon capture and storage projects. But this is very new thinking, especially for our regulators, whose whole education is everything must be competitive immediately. and if you insist on competitive structures immediately, probably you slow down the process because it reduces the incentive to invest.
Okay, you have one more question from chat.
Okay, could you please estimate the efficiency of waste to energy as an alternative? Would it help decrease CO2 and greenhouse gas? Okay, I am not a waste to energy expert. So I suppose the honest answer is no, I can't really give you an approximate efficiency of it. But the waste to energy, the big waste to energy advantage is that waste produces a lot of methane emissions, and collecting methane emissions from waste is something which will potentially decrease not necessarily CO2 emissions, yes, but particularly methane emissions. One of the things that I didn't say on the way through is that when you look at methane emissions in the EU, the biggest source by far is agriculture, and then waste is about the same as oil and gas and coal. So waste is a big story for methane and therefore greenhouse gas emissions. Now there's another which says, how do you assess the competitive Russian natural gas in the era of global energy transition, considering the perspective on cost effectiveness of renewable energy sources and hydrogen? And my answer to that is, I think, as I indicated on the presentation, I think Russian natural gas is in good shape for 10 years in Europe. But principally, that's because it's going to take 10 years to develop these new technologies on a large scale. And particularly, even though renewable energy will take over in the power sector, the other sectors will take more time. Secondly, we are seeing in Europe a much faster decline in domestic production than we had anticipated, principally because of the Netherlands. We are going to see no increase in North African gas supplies, possibly a decrease. I doubt whether we will see very much more gas coming through the southern corridor from the Caspian. So for me, the big competition in Europe now is between Russian gas and LNG. Norway will be static or slowly declining. Now, if we look outside that, I think Russian gas is in okay shape as LNG, particularly with the Northern Sea route. But the pipelines to China, so I showed you a slide on our projections of international pipeline trade. Basically, we think that Power of Siberia 2 will go ahead. We don't know when, but we think that that will be a successful project. China is obviously a very big potential market, and maybe Power of Siberia 2, maybe one other Russian pipeline project to China. But I think that the longer term perspective, as long as you take climate change targets seriously, is that all natural gas exporters are going to see declining exports post 2040. 2030 to 2040, Europe is going to be certainly not growing, probably declining. But Asia, it's going to take another 10 years before Asia sees declining gas, particularly in China, because of their coal situation. Quite a big unknown is India. That's why I mentioned India a lot in the modeling. You see very different ideas of how Indian gas will evolve. Some very bullish, some not so bullish. If Indian gas evolves strongly, then it will need a lot of LNG, some of which could come from Russia.
Okay, very good. That's very interesting. One more question.
Current recession, its long-term impact on what is the stronger effect? Emissions would decrease because of lower cumulative growth, or emissions would increase because of underinvestment in energy transition due to crisis? Great macroeconomic question. I would say again, it will depend which country and which region you're talking about. So I think that in Europe, we could have a very strong impact of recession. And in a sense, we could solve our climate problems through recession. Of course, this is going to raise a whole lot of other problems. When we have huge increases in unemployment, how concerned will the population be about climate change? But in a way, we have already seen in some countries, particularly my own, greenhouse gas emissions fall dramatically post 2008 and that recession. I think when the numbers come through, we will see a major fall in emissions again. But if governments invest as they say they will, then we should see the impact of emissions, the impact on emissions starts to increase again. I know I keep saying this, but if we have success in these technologies, wind and solar, followed by efficiency, followed by increases in carbon prices, which gives the signals to invest even more in efficiency, then I think we could have a strong long-term impact on decarbonisation. If everything goes wrong in economic growth, and I think that's more likely to happen in Europe than, say, in Asia or even in North America. I think Europe is in a very, potentially very difficult position in terms of its economic prosperity. Then the way in which we will solve this climate crisis is by recession, and then the narrative of governments will be, okay, well, emissions have gone down. Okay, they didn't go down as much as we said, and that's a shame, but they've gone down and we don't have so much money. So essentially, we will slow this down, and maybe emissions will drop further because we will invest in efficiency. The really difficult problem is how, having promised their electorates that 2030 we would have this big impact, will they be able to use the pandemic and say, well, we would have done this, but unfortunately the pandemic means we can't do it, and will that be acceptable? And I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that.
No. Vitaly?
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
Good to see you again and again. You mentioned carbon border adjustment mechanism.
Yeah.
This is obviously a big concern for Russia, but is this a concern for the UK? What do you think? Should UK be worried about that?
I think the UK should be worried about it, although we have so many problems now with the EU that that's just yet another problem. But I think I've heard a lot of very strong Russian opposition to carbon border adjustment mechanism, and I think there may be a little bit of overreaction in Russia about this. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to introduce, and the first impacts are going to be in the seriously heavy industry. So I don't know how much steel and cement Russia exports to Europe, but it's those kind of commodities initially which are going to be impacted. But here's now that you've mentioned it, let me say I think this is a measure that will be implemented in Europe because of the concern that our industries, our remaining heavy industries, not so much of them either, but our remaining heavy industries will be impacted unless we can protect them through a mechanism like this. But again, the reality of this is going to be slow, and I think it's going to be limited initially. Once we get into the 2030s, then there will be the dialogue of, okay, you countries which have not instituted these kind of carbon prices, are you serious about climate change? Because we in Europe are serious. And that, I think, so what I'm really saying is, I think there's 10 years to get ready for this, except if you're big exporters of cement, steel, maybe electric power, and the UK is not going to be a big the UK doesn't have so much heavy industry left to be so worried. But let me tell you, we have so many problems post-Brexit with Europe on the trade front that this is not going to be a big deal.
Okay. Just by the way, we had a meeting between European ambassadors in November, and we brought head of some European agency advertising all these new Green Deals to Russians. And I put a few questions. She was actually visibly offended by questions, but she was very polite, and she said that I had described the problem of climate change prevention as a global, means not European problem. We exhausted, I exhausted the description. What was interesting, because to match the question of figure on recession in Europe, what I was asking actually, would be European happy if we have zero emission, but the rest of the world go to poverty, energy poverty, some other poverty, because we have my point that this money could be used in a better manner in our regions. I mean, for reduction of emission, much better, much more efficiently outside Europe. And second, that the poverty is almost out out of headlines, and even reform of the healthcare system is not considered seriously, while it was a really problem of a pandemic. So I think that maybe at some point other urgent global problems may come back, and to make some competition on the political level to the climate change prevention. Probably not in Europe, but on the global scale. But it's just in passing.
So yeah, so I mean, I did say right at the start that outside Europe, climate is not so high on the agenda.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. But what will then happen when the countries meet at the COP meetings and essentially say to Europe or other say to Europe, listen, we can't do this any longer because we have to spend money on other things. That seems to me to be, that scenario is how that plays out is uncertain.
Yeah, and one question on energy, since you are answering question on waste, maybe you can answer one question on coal. The question is very simple. To suppress coal production and use in the on the global scale, one need to suppress production of coal in South Africa, Indonesia, India, China, Russia, United States, Colombia, Germany, Estonia, and Poland. Do you have 10 manufacturers? Who's going to do it politically? And all the considerations on the costs of reducing use of coal, anybody counted the social costs or social costs, or actually social investments in the reforming coal producing regions, or it's still out of picture?
No, it's not out of the picture in Europe. This is the so-called just transition. And there's a just transition fund for exactly this, the countries and the sectors that will be impacted by the transition to low carbon fuels. Now, the Germans have a plan for phasing out coal. It lasts until 2038. They will not phase out coal till 2038, but they have a plan for doing it. Others have an intention. Poland is an interesting example. Are they going to build 6 nuclear reactors? We shall see. Are they going to build enough gas import infrastructure, but excluding all Russian molecules? Again, they seem to think they are. This is going to cost quite a lot of money. But the South Africas, the Indonesias, the Indias, this is the big question about domestic development. And that's why I tried to show you the regional developments, and that was on a very aggregated level. Once you start to ask the question, okay, what will the Indonesian energy balance look like? Now, will Indonesia develop enough renewables to replace coal? Then you with these very large countries with a big coal basis, that is a challenge of a huge order of magnitude more than Europe.
Yeah, that's the problem, that Europe is politically ahead of all events by decades.
Yes.
Politically ahead of technology ahead of costs, costs ahead of only electorate of Europe can slow down the process.
It is,
but
well,
we will see.
it is ahead in ambition. The president of the European has announced that we are going to be the first carbon neutral continent. And it's a major claim, and we're going to do that by 2050. And this generation of politicians, if they fail, maybe we never see them again. On the other hand,
Well,
maybe they're heroes. Maybe they're great heroes that they
no,
deliver what we thought was impossible.
of these people, you cannot be inextinguishable. It's much easier to say in Russian, but I'm afraid I don't know correct word even in Russian. No, it's impossible to get rid of him. No, if they came, they would fight us. To you remember the old joke about Marines at the Dover Heights? It's a British joke.
Say that again. Say it again.
There is an old joke about the platoon of the Marines marching to the drop at the Dover
Yeah.
Heights.
Yeah.
And a lieutenant said, "Go on, we
Yeah.
march to the drop." And he was so afraid he forgot what to say.
Yeah.
So the old sergeant is marching with soldiers, with Marines, and not turning his head,
Right.
not moving his head, saying, uh, uh, Mr. Lieutenant, please at least say farewell, boys.
Yeah.
So they have sent us to I'm afraid that political intensity in Europe is kind of in the contrast. It's not Russian suspicion, because I am more on the global side than on specifically Russian interest side at the moment. I can play both, but basically it's in a, so what you said confirms the multiplicity of a problems and the huge scale of each of the crossroad. So it's a very rare case when in history we had few cases when countries were trying to do forced industrialization and changing fuels. We saw it, but we saw it normally in some autocratic countries. In the same period was the same, 10, 20 years.
Yep.
But very strong power countries and with huge concentration of resources. I am doing right now, we work on Bismarck.
Okay.
That kind of things.
Yep. Yep.
But to do it in the European, it's much bigger scale. It's much bigger scale. Yep. With electorate unsuspicious about losing chances.
And we could do it. We could do it if we had not given ourselves such an ambitious timetable for doing it. That's really the problem. The proposition is not I think problematic. It's the timetable that is so challenging.
But and on Norway, just for your entertainment, you may use it for lectures. I teach masters in English in Moscow. Political department had Norwegian student, tall, nice Norwegian. We were discussing Norwegian electrical car situation, and I knew the answer, so I made some show. Tell me, do you have electrical car? Yes. Do you drive it to the job? Yes. You all Norwegians have electrical? Yes. All Norwegians drive to the job? Yes. But do you have Audi in your garage? Yes. All Norwegians have second car. Yes. And if you go to by Sweden to Denmark in Europe with a girlfriend, what do you drive? So we close we go in this direction. So smooth transition, more or less understandable. It will. Let's go the Norwegian way.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm not doubting that the direction is correct. This is the direction that the whole world will go. Europeans will go faster than others, but we will go in this direction. The problem is the speed and the cost. That's the direction is correct, but the ambition is a problem.
If you don't have any more questions, I just let me say what I told to the public when you were absent, fighting the domestic difficulties. That I used for last 20 years listen at least one year lecture a year. It allows me not to read anything in between.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Len, I think Vitaly has one more question.
Oh, yes, please. Oh, it's your
Yeah.
old hand.
If you allow me.
New hand.
Jonathan, I have a hardball for you.
Okay.
And the question starts with a joke, but then it proceeds with the serious question. Since Prime Minister Thatcher was mentioned already, the rumor has it she once was asked what the key problem with socialism was. And her response was, the key problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of somebody else's money. It seems, and you already indicated during your talk, that the danger is that, first of all, the costs of energy transition are not well defined. And then Europe, as it goes on this course, may run out of money. And therefore, the serious part comes here. Who is going to pay for the transition? Since for the time being, for the next 20 or 30 years, it would involve two parallel energy systems functioning essentially in parallel. The old system based on carbon generating energy and the new carbon-free energy system. There's a huge temptation to use the money generating ability of the old system to pay for the new assets and for new capacities. But
Yes.
Do you see this as a problem?
Yeah, by the way, for the moment we know where money coming from. We're coming from Central European banks at zero rate, Federal Reserve Six at zero rate, and the whole macrofinance world is upside down. But that's macro question.
I mean, the way I would answer that is to say, I think some problems, some parts of the transition are easier to solve than others. So, for example, I think the power sector, we know what the solution is. We add as much renewables as we can. We develop batteries for daily storage, and we have fossil fuels and maybe eventually hydrogen for seasonal storage. And I think that is not so problematic in terms of, it's not cheap, but it's not out of the question. I think the transport sector, except aviation and maybe shipping, is also not so difficult. As we have more development of electric cars, they will become cheaper. They will become mass produced. There is an issue of the infrastructure. In Len's example of you have to take the Audi if you're doing a long trip, I think that will resolve. But heating, and especially high temperature industrial applications. Now, that's hard. And I think that's going to take high temperature industrial applications. You can use hydrogen, but so far only prototypes create, steel, cement, especially in really maybe not so much in Europe, in heavily industrializing countries, but in Europe, the heating sector. How quickly and how much money will it take to retrofit the housing stock, old housing stock? Now, housing stock, which once you start, and I live in London in a 19th century house with a 19th century internet connection. And to try to renovate that, my house, I'm facing it right now. This is even if I get a grant from the government, this is going to be very expensive. So I guess a partial answer to you is we do the simpler things first: power, transportation. The hard things, we may run out of money for that, and we may have to wait longer to do that kind of thing, especially in the big old European cities.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Jonathan. We are sorry to keep squeezing on you, but we are so happy to see you probably travel. Well, eventually, United Kingdom will open to travel.
Yeah, hopefully.
It was used for the previous few centuries. Maybe you'll be traveling again. So we will at the first chance for a conference. We will invite you here.
Well, the first chance I will try to come, but I don't want to have to isolate when I come back, which at the moment is problematic. Yes, because we're not allowed to isolate in our houses. We have to isolate in a government approved hotel, which costs a lot of money. And it's not comfortable either.
It's practically safe.
Okay.
Just in case. If you are planning any trips to the east, give us a notice, and don't come. Don't do it. Come, shoot, and run. Travel is a professor with some rights to stay for another day for dinner.
Yeah, with a caravan. Yes.
Right. Right. Consider Moscow is waiting for you.
Well, thank you guys, and again, apologies for my terrible connection.
No.
It's kind of a record worst connection. Vitaly will tell you that it's not usually quite that bad. It's maybe bad, but not that bad.
It goes under the slogan "Rich VIPs also."
Well, this is going to come down in history as the mysterious case of disappearing Professor Stern.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Everybody happy?
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Good luck. Good luck.